They called it sport. They called it fun. But to Jed, it looked like murder dressed up in laughter. One apple, one bullet, and one woman's life hanging by a thread. And in that moment, every man in Dry Creek showed just how rotten the West could be. The sun was sinking low, stretching long shadows across Dry Creek's dusty Main Street. Wind pushed grit against boots, caught in the creases of old coats, and carried the sharp smell of whiskey out from Dawson's saloon. Folks gathered in a circle, restless for blood or distraction, maybe both. In this town, cruelty was just another form of entertainment. At the center of it all stood a young Apache woman. Her name was Nayeli, though not a soul bothered to speak it. Her wrists were bound tight behind her back, rope biting deep into her skin. Her ankles tied together, forcing her to wobble as she fought to stay upright. The crowd didn't see her pain, they saw only a way to pass the evening. Dawson himself strutted forward, fat with arrogance, apple gleaming in his hand. He polished it against his vest and placed it on Nayeli's head with the showmanship of a carnival barker. The crowd howled with delight. Let's see who's got the steadiest hand. Dawson sneered. Another voice from the mob shouted, winner gets the woman. Laughter cracked louder than the whiskey bottles clinking on the saloon porch. Nayeli stood rigid, her torn dress slipping where the seams had given. She kept her chin high, but her chest hammered with fear. Every jeer cut deeper than the ropes. She refused to cry, refused to give them that victory, though the fire in her throat burned hotter than the desert sun. That was when Jed stepped from the edge of the crowd. He'd been leaning against a post by the livery, hat low, watching it unfold. Jed wasn't known for heroics. He was a rancher, a man who kept to himself and spoke to no one unless forced. Most folks in Dry Creek whispered that he was dangerous, maybe because he carried the look of a man who'd seen too much and spoken too little. But as he watched the apple tremble on Nayeli's head, he felt the weight settle in his chest. It reminded him of other times, of cruelty masquerading as sport. And he'd sworn long ago he wouldn't stand by again. The street fell silent when he stepped into the circle. His revolver hung heavy at his side, its handle worn smooth from years of use. He didn't trade words with Dawson. Didn't bark at the sheriff who smirked from the porch. Jed simply unholstered his pistol, checked the chamber with steady calm, and leveled it at the apple. The crowd hushed. The only sound was the wind rattling the loose shutters. Nayeli locked her knees, staring straight ahead, certain this was how she would die. Jed narrowed his eyes, blocking out the crowd. In that moment, there was no Dawson, no laughter, no saloon. Just the apple. His finger rested light on the trigger, his chest rising slow, steady. The gun cracked like thunder. The apple burst apart, red pieces tumbling into the dust. For a heartbeat, the town was frozen in shock. Then came the roar, shouts, curses, laughter mixed with disbelief. The sheriff slapped his knee, grinning wide. She's yours, Jed. By right of the shot, she's yours. Jed ignored them. Holstering his gun, he strode to Nayeli. She flinched when his hand moved, bracing for another cruelty, but he only drew a knife and sliced her bonds. The ropes fell, leaving angry welts on her wrists. Come on, he said, voice low, steady. Nayeli blinked, stunned, but when he stepped away, her feet carried her forward. The crowd jeered behind them, mocking, angry that their sport had been stolen. But no one moved to stop him. As Jed and Nayeli passed the last building on the edge of town, the noise faded into the wind. What lay ahead was uncertain, but one truth burned clear: Jed had just made himself a target. And he'd done it for a woman he didn't even know. The crowd's jeers still echoed faint behind them, carried on the dry wind, but Jed didn't look back. He set his stride steady, boots grinding in the dirt, each step taking him further from Dry Creek and the trouble he knew he'd just bought. Beside him, Nayeli stumbled, bare feet raw from gravel and rope-burned ankles biting with every step. She said nothing, only clutched the torn edges of her dress tighter against her body. The sun was sinking fast, painting the land in a bruised orange glow. Ahead stretched miles of open country, sagebrush, brittle grass, and ridges cut black against the horizon. It wasn't kind land, but Jed had learned to survive in it. Question was, could she? They walked in silence until her breath came short, sharp like a bird trapped in a cage. Jed slowed his pace, glancing her way. Dust clung to her cheeks, streaked where sweat had cut paths. Her wrists were raw, skin raised angry red where the ropes had chewed her flesh. She noticed him looking and stiffened, as if expecting him to demand thanks or obedience. Instead, Jed pointed toward a line of cottonwoods near a shallow creek. "We'll stop there," he said simply. Nayeli didn't answer. She only followed, her steps uneven, leaving small tracks in the dust behind his heavier prints. By the time they reached the trees, twilight had settled deep. Jed swung his saddlebag to the ground, cleared a patch of dirt, and struck a match. The fire caught, throwing flickering light across the hollow of the creek bed. Nayeli stood apart, arms folded tight, eyes darting like a wild animal ready to bolt. Jed pulled a strip of jerky from his bag and held it out. She hesitated, suspicion written clear across her face, but hunger won. She snatched it quick, chewing slow, eyes never leaving him. He filled a tin cup from his canteen and passed it across. She drank deep, water spilling down her chin, her hands trembling as though every swallow might be the last she'd ever get. "You'll need more than that," Jed said, his voice low, even. For the first time since he cut her loose, Nayeli's eyes met his. Dark, sharp, full of questions he knew she couldn't put into English yet. He looked away, back to the fire. He hadn't planned this. Truth was, he figured she'd run once he cut her free. But she hadn't. She had followed him, step for step, all the way out here. The night stretched long. Coyotes called far off, their cries twisting through the dark. Nayeli wrapped the blanket Jed tossed her around her shoulders, sitting curled tight near the fire. Every crack of branches in the brush made her flinch. She whispered something soft in her own tongue, words carried away by the wind. Jed lay a few feet off, hat tipped low, revolver within reach. Sleep didn't come easy. He stared at the fire until the wood burned down to glowing coals. He told himself he'd only watch long enough to make sure she didn't slip away in the night. But when his eyes finally closed, she was still there, silent, small, but unbroken. At dawn, the land woke cold and pale. Jed stirred first, breath clouding in the chill air. Instinctively his hand brushed the revolver, then eased when he saw her still curled under the blanket. She blinked awake, startled by his movement, clutching the wool closer. "We've got ground to cover," Jed said. He motioned with his hand, rising, gathering his gear. She nodded once, uncertain, but stood. As they moved along the trail, the valley opened wide, nothing but wind and endless sky. Nayeli's steps were slow, her feet raw and bleeding, but she didn't complain. Jed adjusted his pace so she wouldn't fall behind. Hours later, the outline of his ranch finally rose into view, a squat cabin of weathered logs, roof patched with tin, standing against a low ridge. A corral leaned half-empty, 2 gaunt cattle grazing nearby. It wasn't much, but it was all Jed had. He stopped, studying it, then glanced at the woman beside him. She swayed on her feet, exhaustion pulling her shoulders down, but her eyes were still sharp, still watching. "This is it," Jed said flatly. "My place." Nayeli didn't answer. She just stared at the cabin, as if weighing whether this was shelter, or another prison. Jed didn't press her. He stepped to the door, pushed it open, and stood aside. The air inside smelled of dust, old wood, and smoke. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and an iron stove in the corner, that was the whole of it. "Inside," Jed said, steady, not rough. For a long moment, Nayeli hovered at the threshold. Then, slow as a deer stepping into a clearing, she crossed over. Behind her, Jed closed the door. And for the first time in years, the cabin wasn't empty anymore. Jed had never thought much about how his place looked to anyone else. To him, it was just a cabin built to keep out the wind, a stove to keep off the cold, and a bed that didn't ask questions. But as Nayeli stepped inside, her dark eyes sweeping across the room, he felt the weight of every crooked shutter and every layer of dust that had settled in his years alone. She paused near the table, brushing her hand across its rough surface, leaving a faint trail in the dust. Jed set his saddlebag down and moved about the cabin like a man on habit, lighting the stove, checking the firebox, filling a pot with water from his canteen. He didn't speak, and neither did she. The silence was thick, but not the cruel kind he'd left behind in Dry Creek. When the beans began to simmer, Jed slid a tin plate across to her. She stared at it, hesitant, then sat and ate like she hadn't seen a proper meal in days. Her hands shook at first, but after a while her pace slowed, and she dared a glance at him. Jed met her eyes briefly, then looked down at his own plate. He wasn't good with words, and he wasn't about to start pretending now. After they ate, Jed asked the only question that mattered. "You got a name?" His voice was rough, almost unused. She touched her chest lightly. "Nayeli." Jed nodded once. He tapped his chest. "Jed." The exchange hung in the air heavier than it should have, two names bridging the distance between strangers. The next day, routine began to creep in. Jed set to work outside mending a broken fence rail, the hammer striking sharp against the ridge. When he looked back toward the cabin, he saw Nayeli standing in the doorway, blanket around her shoulders, watching him. She didn't smile. She didn't look away either. Later, when he returned, the floor inside had been swept clean. His tools, once scattered across the table, were stacked neat. She'd even folded the old blanket that had been tossed across the bed. Jed froze a moment, surprised, then hung his coat by the door like it was the most natural thing in the world. As the days passed, small changes added up. The stove was always warm. The cabin smelled less like dust and more like cooking. His shirts, ragged from years of use, appeared mended with clumsy stitches. And though she said little, Nayeli worked with the steady rhythm of someone determined to carve out a place where she wasn't unwanted. One evening, as the fire flickered low, Jed leaned back in his chair, sharpening his knife. Across from him, Nayeli mended the torn sleeve of her dress. Her stitches were uneven, but her hands were steady. She caught him watching once and lowered her eyes, cheeks darkening in the firelight. "Why me?" she asked suddenly, her English broken but her meaning sharp. Jed frowned. "What do you mean?" She pointed to herself, voice trembling but clear. "Why free?" He set the knife down, rubbed the scar along his jaw. The truth wasn't easy, but he gave it plain. "Because I couldn't stand there and watch." Nayeli studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. She didn't ask again. That night, when Jed laid the blanket by the stove, she didn't take the floor right away. She sat in the chair instead, staring into the flames, her eyes unblinking. Jed watched her a moment longer before turning in. Sleep came hard, as it always did, but when he finally drifted off, the steady rhythm of her breathing filled the cabin. And for the first time in years, Jed's home didn't feel empty. The sky turned mean that evening, the kind of gray that rolled in low and heavy, promising trouble. Jed felt it in his bones long before the rain started. He split wood at the block, stacking it high against the cabin wall, while the wind began to rattle through the ridge like a freight of ghosts. By the time the first drops slapped the ground, he was already hauling the last armful inside. The storm came fast and hard. Rain hammered the tin roof, found every weak seam, and bled cold water down the walls. The shutters groaned against the wind. Inside, the fire hissed and popped, throwing wild shadows across the cabin. Jed tossed another log on and sat back, hat resting low, revolver always within arm's reach. Nayeli sat near the stove, knees tucked to her chest, hair loose from the day's work. Strands clung to her face, damp from where the roof leaked above her. Her dress, patched but thin, clung to her shoulders. She pulled the blanket tighter but still shivered. Jed poured hot water into a tin cup and slid it across. "Drink. It'll keep the cold off." Her fingers brushed his as she took it, slower than before, not snatching like the first night by the creek. She sipped, then looked at him over the rim, her eyes sharp but searching. "Why you alone?" she asked suddenly. The words came broken, but her meaning cut clear. Jed leaned back, staring into the fire. He hadn't spoken on it in years, but the storm outside left little room for silence. "Lost people," he said at last. "War took some. Time took the rest. Easier to stay alone than bury more." Nayeli studied him in the flickering light. She didn't speak, but her gaze told him she understood more than he expected. There was no pity in her eyes, only recognition, like she carried her own graves behind her. The rain pounded harder, the cabin shaking under the weight of it. For a moment, they just listened, two survivors trapped in a box of wood against a world that wanted them gone. Jed shifted in his chair, voice rough. "You're safe here." The words felt heavy, awkward on his tongue, but honest. Nayeli's eyes softened. She pulled the blanket close and gave one slow nod. "Safe," she repeated, her accent shaping the word, but steady. Something shifted then, quiet but undeniable. Their silence wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't sharp or suspicious. It carried warmth, like the fire between them. When their fingers brushed again over the tin cup, neither pulled away. Lightning flashed white through the cracks, thunder rolling right on top of it. Nayeli startled, breath catching. Jed set his hand steady on the table, close to hers but not forcing. She stared at it for a long beat before setting her hand down too, their knuckles touching in the firelight. Jed swallowed hard, jaw tight. He wasn't a man given to gestures, but this was more than words could carry. Nayeli tilted her head, eyes locked on his. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You want me go?" He shook his head slow, certain. "No." The storm roared outside, but inside the cabin, something steadier rose. Their lips met soft, hesitant at first, then firmer, sealing a truth that had been building since the moment he cut her free. When they pulled apart, the fire cracked loud, thunder chasing it. Jed rested his forehead against hers, breath coming hard. She leaned into him, not pulling back. For the first time in years, Jed didn't feel like a man waiting for loss. He felt like a man with something worth holding on to. And in the middle of that storm, in the small flicker of firelight, the empty cabin became something it had never been before, home. The days after the storm were quiet, almost too quiet. Jed fixed fence posts, hauled water, and kept his rifle close, though the valley seemed still as glass. Yet in his gut, he knew it wouldn't last. Men like Dawson didn't forgive, and men like Cole and Mason didn't forget. One morning, as Jed rode the ridge checking for strays, he spotted dust trails cutting across the valley. 3 riders. He didn't need a closer look to know what kind of trouble they carried. He turned his horse hard and pushed it back toward the cabin, the leather reins burning against his palms. When he stepped inside, Nayeli was tending the stove, her dark hair loose, humming low under her breath. She stopped when she saw his face. "Men coming," Jed said flat, pointing toward the horizon. Her eyes widened, but instead of retreating, she reached for the small kitchen knife lying on the table. Her grip was clumsy, but her voice steady. "No hide." Jed wanted to argue, to put her behind the door where she might be safe, but one look at her eyes told him it'd do no good. That same fire that had carried her through ropes and humiliation now burned in defiance. He gave one short nod. By the time the riders pulled up, the rain-washed earth was already trembling under their horses. Cole rode in front, lean and mean, a scar splitting down his cheek. Mason, broad-shouldered and brutish, flanked him. The third man was another drifter, face half-shadowed under his hat. Cole leaned forward in the saddle, grinning like a wolf. You made a fool of us in Dry Creek, Jed. You think you can just walk out with Dawson's property? Jed stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled steady in his arms. His voice was low, calm as a still pond. She ain't property. The grin fell off Cole's face. He drew his revolver, letting it dangle loose in his hand. Mason and the third rider followed suit. Behind Jed, the cabin door creaked. Nayeli stepped out, blanket slipping from her shoulders, knife clutched in her hand. The men on horseback laughed, pointing. Look at that, Mason jeered. She thinks she's a fighter. Jed's gut turned cold, but his hands never wavered. He leveled the rifle. Last warning. Turn back. Cole spat into the dirt. She's coming with us. The shot split the morning. Jed's rifle cracked like thunder, and Cole tumbled sideways off his horse, clutching his shoulder with a howl. His horse reared, screaming against the bit. Mason fired wild, bullets splintering wood off the cabin post. Jed dropped low, chambered another round, and fired again. Mason's hat flew from his head, the round grazing close enough to spin him in the saddle. The third rider cursed, yanked his reins, and tore off across the valley in retreat. Mason, seeing Cole bleeding in the mud, yanked his horse hard and followed, leaving a trail of dust and rage behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the groans of Cole dragging himself up onto his horse, blood soaking his shirt. His eyes burned through the pain, fixed on Jed with a promise of vengeance. Then he turned, spurring his mount after the others. Jed lowered his rifle slow, breath ragged. The smell of gunpowder hung sharp in the air. Beside him, Nayeli's knuckles were white around the knife, her chest heaving, but her chin high. She turned her eyes to Jed. You see, she said, voice trembling but strong. No hide. Jed stared at her, the fire in her gaze as fierce as the storm that had passed days before. He gave a single nod. No hide. Together, they stepped back inside the cabin. The air was close with fear and smoke, but something else too, the certainty that whatever storm came next, they would face it side by side. The gun smoke had long since drifted away, but the memory of it clung to the cabin like a second skin. Jed sat at the table, rifle across the boards, his jaw tight as stone. He could still hear the retreating hoofbeats of Cole and Mason, still see the fury in their eyes. Trouble wasn't gone, it was waiting out there, nursing its wounds. Nayeli sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a tin cup though the water inside had gone cold. She wasn't trembling anymore. Her chin was high, her dark eyes steady. She had seen death reach for her more than once, and she had stood her ground. You fought for me, she said at last, her English rough but clear. Jed exhaled slow, staring into the grain of the table. I fight for what's mine to protect, he muttered. He stopped, the weight of his own words catching him. His voice dropped lower, softer. Not because you're property. Because you're under my roof. Because you're here. Nayeli's lips curved in the faintest of smiles, the first he'd ever seen from her. She set the cup down and crossed the short space between them, her hand brushing against his shoulder. For a man who'd lived years with nothing but silence, the touch felt heavier than any battle scar. The days that followed carried a strange calm. No riders came down the valley. No dust rose on the horizon. Jed kept his rifle near, but with each sunrise and each empty stretch of land, the weight in his chest eased. And in that time, the cabin began to change. Nayeli mended his shirts with careful stitches, patched the old blanket, and stacked wood by the stove higher than it had ever been in Jed's years alone. She hummed low songs in her language while she scrubbed pans with sand from the creek. Jed found himself listening, comforted by sounds he didn't understand but somehow felt. One morning, he returned from the corral to find the smell of bread in the air, real bread, baking in his stove. He froze in the doorway, struck by a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Nayeli looked up from the counter, flour dusting her hands, and for once she didn't look wary. She smiled, small but sure. That night, by the fire, she asked the question that had hung between them like a shadow. "You want me stay? Always?" Jed looked at her across the flames. He thought of Dry Creek, of the night he cut her free, of the storm, of the bullets fired at his door. He thought of the silence he'd carried all those years, and how it had been broken not by words, but by her steady presence. "Yes," he said finally, voice rough but certain. "I want you here. For good." Her eyes softened, relief flickering across her face. She leaned forward, touched his hand. "Then I stay." Jed's fingers closed around hers. A weight lifted, one he hadn't known he still carried. Spring came slow to the valley. Together, they turned a patch of earth behind the cabin, planting seeds, watering from the creek. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. In the evenings, they sat shoulder to shoulder on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer sharp or heavy, it was peace. Sometimes Naeli hummed. Sometimes Jed told her about the land, where the cattle liked to graze, where the creek swelled after rain. And one evening, as the sky burned gold, she said it plain, "You my home." Jed turned to her, throat tight. "And you're mine." For a man who had lost everything, and a woman who had been treated as nothing, they had built something the world couldn't take away. Not easily. Not anymore. The wind carried across the valley, cool and steady, but inside that small cabin, the fire of two lives burned strong. If you were Jed, would you risk everything, your land, your life, your peace, to protect a stranger and turn them into family?